Everyone mocked the young waitress who rushed to help a fallen old woman. But the truth waiting behind that moment would silence an entire restaurant. Don't scroll. This isn't just a story, it's a reminder of what real humanity looks like. The room froze. The clinking of silverware stopped mid-air. A half-lifted wine glass trembled in someone's hand, and the warm light filtering through the tall windows flickered across a scene nobody expected. In the center of the upscale dining room, white tablecloths, crisp chairs, perfectly aligned, waiters gliding like dancers, an elderly woman lay on the polished floor, her coat pooled around her like wilted fabric, and kneeling beside her was Emily, the youngest waitress on staff, barely 22. Her blonde hair was tied in a neat bun, a burgundy apron hugging her small frame. She had been carrying a tray of water glasses when she saw the woman stumble. Without hesitation, Emily had dropped to her knees, one hand braced behind the old woman's back, the other gently supporting her arm. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Ma'am, don't move yet. Are you hurt? Her voice was calm, soft, steady, but the reaction around her was far from kind. At a nearby table, a group of businessmen in tailored suits burst into laughter. One of them leaned back in his chair, pointing at Emily like she was the evening's entertainment. His grin stretched too wide, too self-satisfied, exactly like in the photo you shared. "Oh, look at that," he said loudly. "The little waitress wants to be a hero." Another snickered, elbowing his friend. "She's blocking the aisle. Someone get her out of the way before she makes it worse." Emily heard every word, but she didn't look at them. She only focused on the trembling woman beneath her hands. Behind her, a few waitstaff hesitated. They stood stiffly near the wall, smiling awkwardly in the overly polite way service workers do when chaos unfolds, but they're not allowed to react. Nobody moved to help, too afraid of violating the restaurant's pristine image. Only Emily acted. The elderly woman blinked up at her, breath uneven, silver hair falling out of place. Up close, Emily could see the woman's face pale with shock and pain. "I'm so sorry," the woman whispered. "My ankle, it just gave out." "It's okay," Emily said. "I've got you." Just then, the restaurant manager stormed in from behind the bar, face tight, voice low and furious. "Emily," he hissed through clenched teeth, "what do you think you're doing? This is a fine dining establishment, not a nursing home. Get up, you're causing a scene." "She didn't move. She fell," Emily answered, still supporting the woman. "I'm helping her." "You're embarrassing us," he shot back. "Stand up, now." "Oh?" The businessman laughed even louder, enjoying every second of her humiliation. One of them raised his glass as if to toast the moment, but the old woman clutched Emily's arm with surprising strength, eyes wide, not frightened, but urgent, almost emotional. "Thank you," she whispered. Nobody else came. Those words pierced the noise around them. Emily swallowed hard. Her heart thudded, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not leaving you." Something shifted in the room. A stillness. Emily gently helped the elderly woman sit up, completely unaware that the next person about to walk through the restaurant doors would turn this humiliating moment upside down, and that her simple act of kindness was seconds away from changing everything. Because the woman she was holding wasn't just a random diner. She was someone the entire room would soon recognize, and someone whose son would arrive any moment, with enough power to silence every cruel laugh. Emily kept one steady arm around the elderly woman as the restaurant manager hovered nearby, shifting anxiously while glancing toward the entrance, clearly torn between maintaining the establishment's polished image and berating her for disrupting the flow of service. The businessmen who had mocked her earlier leaned back in their leather chairs with smug satisfaction, their laughter rippling across the dining room like a cruel soundtrack that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Although Emily tried to tune them out, each snicker cut deeper, reminding her that in their eyes she was nothing more than a disposable worker undeserving of respect. The elderly woman tried again to adjust her position, wincing sharply as her hand tightened around Emily's forearm, which prompted the young waitress to lean in closer and encourage her with quiet confidence that everything would be all right. Emily's voice carried a warm steadiness that contrasted starkly with the cold detachment displayed by the surrounding diners, whose interest in the situation extended only as far as their amusement. She had worked enough double shifts to know that kindness rarely granted her protection, yet she refused to abandon the woman despite the hostile eyes watching her every move. The manager crouched halfway, pretending to help while whispering harshly that Emily needed to step aside immediately, insisting that the restaurant could not afford the spectacle she was creating so close to the main aisle. Emily shook her head without raising her voice, stating calmly that the woman could be seriously injured and should not be moved abruptly, which only infuriated him further, because her refusal challenged his authority in front of other staff. Several waiters exchanged uncertain glances, silently acknowledging her courage while fearing the consequences they might face if they supported her openly. Meanwhile, the businessmen continued their commentary with exaggerated expressions of mock concern, and one of them loudly declared that he hoped the restaurant offered clown training for servers who insisted on creating unnecessary drama. Another leaned toward his table mates, smirking proudly as he claimed that employees like Emily always tried to gain sympathy because they lacked real competence. Their remarks bounced around the room freely, growing bolder with each moment of inaction from management, creating an atmosphere that felt increasingly hostile and suffocating. Emily forced herself to stay focused on the elderly woman, whose pale face softened with gratitude as she murmured that she did not blame Emily for the commotion and appreciated her gentle care amidst so much indifference. Emily felt a subtle shift inside her chest, a quiet surge of determination pushing her to shield the woman even more fiercely, because no one else seemed willing to treat her with simple human dignity. She reached for a chair, carefully helping the woman rest against it without aggravating her ankle, then removed her own folded napkin to cushion the woman's wrist where she had landed on the hard floor. The manager's irritation grew more visible when he noticed several guests filming softly with their phones, prompting him to instruct Emily in a strained voice to move along and stop creating liability issues for the restaurant's reputation. Emily, exhausted but unyielding, repeated that she couldn't abandon someone clearly in pain, especially not in a place where people pretended to value refinement while ignoring the simplest form of compassion. Her words weren't loud, yet they carried a sincerity that caused a few diners on the far side to shift uncomfortably, as if they were suddenly aware of their own silence. A young busser approached nervously with a glass of water, unsure whether to hand it to Emily or the manager, but Emily smiled gratefully and asked him to hold it steady while she helped the elderly woman take a slow sip. The old woman's eyes glistened with emotion, and she whispered that Emily reminded her of someone she once knew, someone patient and kind, who believed goodness mattered even when nobody noticed. Hearing that, Emily felt her throat tighten slightly, though she maintained a composed posture because she knew drawing attention to her emotions would only embolden those laughing nearby. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted as soft murmurs spread from the entrance, where several staff members straightened their uniforms and widened their eyes in recognition of a figure approaching the dining area. The manager stiffened instantly, smoothing his jacket and adjusting his tie to prepare for the arrival of a high-profile guest he clearly wanted to impress. Emily sensed the shift in energy but remained beside the elderly woman, choosing not to look toward the growing commotion until she felt the woman's hand relax briefly against her arm. The businessmen paused their laughter when a tall, sharply dressed man stepped through the doorway, his confident presence absorbing the attention of nearly every guest in the room. His expression carried the weight of authority, and the subtle urgency in his stride suggested he was searching for someone specific, not merely arriving for a quiet meal. Several employees whispered among themselves that he was an influential business magnate known for his cold precision and immense power, and as he continued scanning the room, a hush settled unexpectedly over the tables. Emily did not recognize him at first, but the elderly woman inhaled sharply, her eyes widening with sudden emotion that seemed to reach far deeper than simple surprise. The moment felt suspended in time as the distinguished man locked onto the scene before him. A humbled group of businessmen frozen mid-smirk, a cluster of nervous staff watching silently, and at the center of it all, a young waitress kneeling beside his mother. Every face in the restaurant shifted as he stepped forward, and although Emily didn't yet understand who he was, something in his gaze signaled that everything was about to change. The storm that had been gathering quietly in the background was finally taking shape, and the balance of power in the room was seconds away from turning in a direction no one had anticipated. The tall man strode across the dining room with a sense of urgency that cut through the heavy silence, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with sharp precision that made several diners instinctively straighten in their seats. His tailored navy suit contrasted with the soft golden light streaming through the windows, and his focused gaze swept across the room until it anchored on the elderly woman resting against the chair with Emily crouched protectively beside her. For a moment he froze completely, the confident composure on his face cracking just enough for anyone paying attention to notice that something far more personal than business had just claimed his full attention. Then, without hesitation, he hurried forward, ignoring the stunned guests who parted swiftly to make space for him, and dropped to one knee beside the woman with a level of tenderness that immediately revealed their deep connection. Emily watched his expression transform from guarded intensity to raw worry as he reached for the woman's trembling hands, asking softly if she was hurt and whether she could move without severe discomfort. The elderly woman tried to reassure him with a strained smile, insisting that she would be fine, although her weak voice betrayed the pain still lingering in her ankle and wrist. The businessman's voice shook slightly as he asked who had helped her, glancing around at the surrounding tables as though expecting someone reputable or medically trained to step forward. When no one responded and the businessman who had mocked Emily earlier looked away guiltily, he turned back to his mother and gently asked how long she had been lying there without assistance. The woman lifted her shaking hand and pointed directly at Emily, her expression softening as she explained that the young waitress had been the only person willing to help her when everyone else remained frozen in their seats. Hearing that, the man exhaled slowly, clearly torn between relief and rising anger, and finally shifted his gaze toward Emily with an intensity that made her straighten instinctively, unsure whether she was about to be thanked or scolded. His eyes held a quiet depth that suggested he was replaying the entire scene in his mind, trying to piece together everything that had led to his mother sitting on the floor of an exclusive restaurant surrounded by people who had failed to act. Emily tried to hold his gaze but found herself faltering under the sudden weight of attention from someone who carried so much obvious power. The manager, seizing an opportunity to regain control, rushed forward with exaggerated concern and attempted to explain that the fall had been unavoidable and that the staff had been preparing to intervene when Emily, unfortunately, overstepped, her role in a misguided attempt to manage the situation. His voice carried the sickeningly polished tone of someone trying to reshape a narrative in real time, crafted only to protect his image rather than acknowledge what had truly happened. Emily felt the familiar sting of being scapegoated, yet she remained silent because she sensed that the truth would reveal itself without her needing to defend her actions. The powerful man slowly rose to his full height, turning his head toward the manager with a cold stare that caused several nearby diners to sit rigidly, as if anticipating a storm about to break. His voice, low and controlled yet unmistakably dangerous, cut through the room like a blade as he demanded to know why no staff member besides Emily had assisted his mother and why she had been forced to rely on one young waitress while everyone else stood frozen. The manager's confident posture crumbled visibly as he stumbled through excuses, claiming that he had been coordinating support from other employees and that Emily had acted impulsively in a way that complicated proper protocol. Emily expected him to believe the manager's explanation, yet his expression hardened further as he interrupted sharply, stating that he had observed enough from the moment he walked in to determine that fear, pride, and indifference had paralyzed the room rather than protocol. The businessmen at the nearby table shifted uncomfortably, and one attempted to murmur an apology, though it came out more like an excuse, revealing the hollow nature of his earlier confidence. The man's glare landed on them with such precision that they fell silent, their humiliation rendered complete without a single additional word spoken. Then he turned back to Emily, who was still kneeling beside his mother, and something softened in his features, as though he recognized a sincerity in her that sharply contrasted with the arrogance displayed by the rest of the room. He thanked her quietly but firmly, making sure his voice carried far enough for every guest to hear that she had been the only person with enough integrity to act while others chose comfort over compassion. Emily felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and relief, yet she kept her eyes lowered because she did not want to appear as though she sought praise or reward for doing the right thing. The elderly woman squeezed Emily's hand gently, affirming that she felt safe because of her, and insisted that she trusted Emily's judgment more than anyone else in the room. Her son nodded, helping her stand while instructing the staff to bring a wheelchair immediately, but he maintained his gaze on Emily with an intensity that made it clear he was silently memorizing the face of the person who had protected his mother. Emily felt a strange mixture of humility and unease, sensing that this moment was shifting her path in a direction she could neither predict nor fully comprehend. Guests whispered among themselves, stunned by the unexpected familial connection and chastened by their earlier inaction, each realizing how quickly power and shame could collide in a single unguarded moment. The manager attempted once more to reassert control by offering to personally escort the family to a private dining area, but the businessman cut him off before he finished speaking, insisting that Emily remain with them because she was the only one he trusted to keep his mother comfortable. As the wheelchair arrived and Emily stepped forward to assist, the weight of the room's judgment pressed behind her like a heavy curtain finally beginning to fall, and while she followed them toward the quieter section of the restaurant, she realized that the cruel laughter from minutes earlier had vanished completely, replaced by a charged silence that hinted at consequences not yet revealed. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and although Emily did not yet know what it meant for her future, she could feel the unmistakable tremor of change beginning to take shape around her. As Emily guided the wheelchair toward the quieter end of the dining room, she sensed a subtle tension radiating from the powerful man walking beside her, as though he were observing every tiny movement she made while silently analyzing the intentions behind them. He kept one hand gently on his mother's shoulder, yet his eyes drifted often toward Emily, studying her with a depth that felt both intimidating and strangely appreciative, creating an unspoken connection she didn't understand. The rest of the restaurant remained suspended in an uneasy hush, with diners pretending to resume their meals even though their attention kept drifting toward the trio, moving calmly through the room. When they reached a private alcove near the back wall, the warm lighting softened the atmosphere, and the noise of clinking glasses faded enough for an odd sense of intimacy to settle over the small space. Emily knelt once more to make sure the elderly woman was comfortable in the wheelchair, adjusting her scarf gently and asking whether she felt any sharp pain that required immediate medical attention. The woman smiled tenderly, assuring her that the discomfort had eased thanks to Emily's careful support, and she placed her hand over Emily's with an affectionate squeeze that carried the quiet gratitude of someone unaccustomed to receiving genuine kindness. Her son watched the interaction with visible emotion, his expression shifting between concern for his mother and a growing curiosity about the young woman who had stepped in so quickly without hesitation. Emily stood slowly, smoothing her apron in a nervous gesture, and finally met his gaze long enough to recognize the intelligence and sharp intuition reflected behind his dark eyes. Something about the way he looked at her made her feel exposed, as though he could see beneath the surface of her professionalism and read the quiet resilience she tried so hard to protect. For several seconds he said nothing, creating a silence that held a delicate tension, until he finally asked in a low, unwavering voice why she had reacted so quickly when so many others remained frozen. The question carried a tone that was neither accusatory nor disbelieving, but rather weighted with genuine curiosity, as though her answer held a significance he couldn't ignore. Emily swallowed lightly before responding, explaining that she had simply acted on instinct because no one deserved to lie helpless while others watched without lifting a hand. Her voice wavered only slightly, yet her sincerity filled the space between them like a small, steady flame. He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing with thoughtful intensity, and stepped a little closer as though her response had drawn him toward her without his explicit permission. The shift was subtle yet unmistakable, and Emily's heartbeat quickened when she noticed the closeness, though she forced herself to maintain a composed exterior. His presence carried a calm authority, but beneath it she sensed a complicated blend of emotions: frustration with the restaurant's indifference, protectiveness toward his mother, and a budding intrigue toward the young woman who had disrupted an entire room simply by choosing empathy over convenience. The man introduced himself as Alexander Ward, a name Emily immediately recognized from local business articles and philanthropic reports, though she had never expected to meet him under such circumstances. When she murmured his name in surprise, his mother chuckled softly, remarking that she always found it amusing when people realized her son was far more approachable than his reputation suggested. Emily smiled at the comment, but Alexander's gaze held hers a moment longer than necessary, creating a spark of connection that caused her breath to catch unexpectedly. He asked whether she had family nearby or if she worked multiple jobs to support herself, demonstrating an interest that felt unusually personal for someone of his stature. And Emily hesitated before answering because she didn't want to reveal too much of her private life. Yet something about his sincerity compelled her to offer a small truth, admitting that she worked long shifts to keep up with rent and tuition, hoping to finish her community college program if her schedule allowed. His expression softened noticeably at her words, revealing a hint of admiration that carried far more meaning than he intended to show. Before Emily could shift the conversation away from herself, Alexander reached for a napkin and handed it to her, quietly noting the faint bruise forming on her knee from kneeling on the hard floor earlier. The gesture startled her more than his questions, because it conveyed a level of attentiveness she rarely experienced from customers, especially those accustomed to commanding rooms, rather than noticing the small wounds of those serving them. She took the napkin with a polite thank you, feeling an unexpected warmth rise in her chest that she quickly tried to suppress. The elderly woman watched the interaction with a knowing smile, and her gentle amusement only heightened the tension hovering in the air, giving Emily the sense that something unspoken was forming slowly yet unmistakably between her and Alexander. She stepped back slightly to restore a more professional distance, reminding herself that she was still on duty and that her responsibility was to provide comfort, not to indulge in the strange pull she felt around him. Yet Alexander's gaze followed her retreat with quiet intensity, as if he were trying to understand why she kept putting space between them. After ensuring his mother was settled, he turned to Emily once more and asked a question that felt far more pointed than the others, wondering what had truly motivated her to step forward when everyone else chose to look away. His voice carried a quieter vulnerability now, almost as though he were testing whether her compassion extended beyond duty and into something deeper. Emily held his gaze for a long moment before answering that her parents had raised her to never ignore someone in need, even if it meant standing alone in a crowd. Her words seemed to strike something within him because he looked away briefly, exhaling as if he were wrestling with a realization he had not expected to encounter today. When he faced her again, his expression was softened yet contemplative, carrying the unspoken message that he had more questions he wished to ask and more truth he wanted to uncover about the young woman who had already shifted the tone of the afternoon. The tension between them grew thicker, not hostile, but charged with a quiet curiosity that neither seemed ready to confront directly. As Emily prepared to step aside to check on other tables, Alexander gently placed a hand on the back of the wheelchair and stopped her with a calm request, asking her to stay nearby for a little longer in case his mother required assistance. His voice held a warmth laced with subtle insistence that made Emily freeze for a heartbeat, realizing that he was not simply asking for service but requesting her presence specifically. The moment hung between them like a delicate thread, shimmering with possibility, signaling that the imbalance of power in the room was beginning to shift towards something far more complex than authority alone. Emily remained close to Mrs. Ward's side, maintaining a careful professional distance while still attentive enough to respond at the slightest sign of discomfort, yet she couldn't ignore the growing unease settling beneath her ribs as the restaurant's atmosphere shifted from subdued curiosity to something sharper and far more threatening. The businessmen who had mocked her earlier sat rigidly in their seats now, whispering among themselves in increasingly panicked tones, clearly aware that their laughter had not gone unnoticed and that the consequences of their arrogance might be unfolding sooner than expected. Their sudden change in demeanor contrasted sharply with the earlier confidence they flaunted, making the quiet tension radiating from their table feel thick enough to cut through with a knife. Alexander sensed the shift as well, though he remained focused on ensuring his mother was comfortable, offering her soft reassurances even as his sharp gaze tracked every suspicious movement around the room like a man accustomed to identifying threats before they surfaced. He leaned down briefly to check the positioning of Mrs. Ward's ankle, listening carefully as she described a lingering stiffness that worried him enough to suggest medical evaluation, yet Emily noticed the underlying weight in his voice, hinting that the situation carried deeper implications than a simple fall. Although she knew very little about his world, she could tell from his guarded posture that he was accustomed to protecting his mother not only from physical harm but also from the unseen pressures and dangers woven into the lives of the wealthy. The restaurant manager, who had hovered uncertainly near them, suddenly straightened his jacket and approached with an overly polished smile, clearly attempting to salvage his reputation before Alexander decided to escalate the issue or demand disciplinary action. His voice dripped with forced politeness as he apologized repeatedly for the inconvenience, insisting that the staff was fully committed to ensuring the comfort and safety of all guests, a claim so blatantly untrue that Emily had to swallow her frustration to avoid contradicting him openly. Alexander listened without nodding, his expression unreadable, though Emily sensed that his silence was not acceptance, but rather a strategic pause meant to observe the manager's true intentions. Before the manager could continue his insincere monologue, one of the businessmen, emboldened by desperation rather than confidence, stood abruptly and attempted to interject with a clumsy apology, claiming that he and his colleagues had misunderstood the situation and had only laughed because they believed the elderly woman had tripped harmlessly. His explanation faltered instantly when he realized how hollow it sounded, especially with half the dining room having witnessed their mocking expressions and dismissive comments earlier. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, and though he didn't speak, the cold intensity behind his gaze made the man swallow hard and retreat awkwardly to his seat. At that moment, a subtle but unmistakable whisper drifted from a nearby table, carried by a young hostess who leaned discreetly toward the manager while trying to shield her words from view. Emily couldn't hear exactly what she said, but she saw the manager's face blanch before he straightened suddenly, his eyes darting toward the entrance with a mixture of dread and irritation. The hostess slipped away quickly, yet the ripple of tension she left behind told Emily something significant had just been revealed, something the manager desperately wished he could undo. The manager approached Alexander once more, this time with a strained voice, informing him that the owner of the restaurant might be arriving unexpectedly due to a miscommunication about the importance of the guest in the dining room. Alexander raised a brow at the explanation, clearly recognizing the lie for what it was, and Emily noticed how the manager's hands trembled slightly as he attempted to maintain his composure. The implication was clear. The owner wasn't coming because of a mistake. He was coming because someone had contacted him in panic, likely fearing the fallout of mistreating a billionaire's mother in one of the city's most prestigious establishments. Emily felt her stomach tighten as she realized the gravity of the situation was escalating beyond a simple confrontation, because the arrival of the owner meant that accountability would no longer be limited to the manager's decisions but extended upward through the entire chain of command. She also knew instinctively that the businessmen were terrified for the same reason, fearing that their behavior would be reported to someone with the power to impact their professional and social reputations in ways they were entirely unprepared to handle. The restaurant had transformed from a place of leisure to a stage where every expression, whisper, and gesture carried consequences far larger than anyone had anticipated. Alexander stepped forward slightly, lowering his voice as he asked the manager whether the staff had documented the fall, whether there were any witnesses prepared to give honest accounts, and whether the restaurant had appropriate procedures for incidents involving elderly guests. The manager stammered through his answers, revealing through his hesitation that nothing had been recorded and no protocols had been followed because he had been too focused on maintaining superficial appearances rather than prioritizing safety. Emily felt Alexander's frustration simmering just beneath the surface, yet he remained composed, letting the facts expose the negligence without raising his voice even once. The deeper truth became unavoidable. The restaurant's failure had nothing to do with oversight and everything to do with a culture that valued wealthy customers more than human dignity, a truth Emily had known for months, but had never seen laid bare so openly. Mrs. Ward watched her son quietly, her expression soft yet stern, as though she recognized the familiar restraints he placed on himself whenever duty and anger intersected. She reached for his hand gently, grounding him with a touch that conveyed both reassurance and encouragement, reminding him that empathy, not fury, was the foundation of their strength. As Emily observed this interaction, she realized with a quiet ache that the situation had evolved into something far larger than a fall, a mockery, or even the pending arrival of the restaurant owner. It had become a crossroads where integrity met power, where kindness illuminated neglect, and where the decisions made in the next few minutes would shape the fates of everyone involved. Beneath the soft glow of the alcove lights, Emily felt the rising pressure of hidden stakes pressing heavily upon her, signaling that the real conflict was only beginning to emerge from the shadows. Emily felt the weight of the entire restaurant pressing against her chest as the manager tried once again to reclaim control of the situation, his voice growing sharper with each passing moment as he attempted to frame himself as the responsible authority rather than the embarrassed supervisor who had ignored a vulnerable woman lying on the floor. He stepped closer to her with an expression that oscillated between anger and desperation, insisting that she return to her regular duties immediately because lingering near the Ward family was unprofessional and created unnecessary complications for the staff. Emily knew his sudden interest in protocol had nothing to do with maintaining standards and everything to do with shifting blame before the owner arrived and demanded accountability from those who had allowed negligence to take center stage. She could feel Alexander watching her from just behind the manager's shoulder, his presence radiating a steady support that contrasted sharply with the manager's brittle facade. Yet she refused to let either influence the decision forming quietly within her. The room buzzed with the soft hum of guests trying to appear uninterested while still absorbing every detail, and Emily understood that her next words would ricochet far beyond the small alcove where she stood. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of confrontation, but from the pressure of standing alone in a room filled with people who held far more power and influence than she ever would. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and unwavering, surprising even herself with its clarity, as she told the manager that she would not abandon Mrs. Ward until she was certain the woman was safe. The words echoed like a soft but undeniable chime in the suspended quiet, drawing the attention of diners whose earlier smirks had already faded into anxious silence. Emily could feel the manager stiffen, his frustration simmering beneath a polite smile that cracked almost instantly as he demanded to know whether she understood the consequences of defying a direct instruction from her superior. Emily met his gaze fully for the first time since the incident began and answered that consequences mattered far less to her than doing what was right, especially when someone needed help and nobody else had stepped forward. The honesty of her statement seemed to stun the manager into momentary silence, and a flicker of indignation crossed his features as he realized that he no longer controlled the narrative, not with Alexander standing close enough to hear every word. The businessmen who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly realizing that each truthful sentence from Emily further exposed their own cowardice and cruelty. Mrs. Ward reached for Emily's hand with a gentle squeeze that felt like a silent endorsement, reminding her that compassion carried a quiet strength that no amount of mockery could dismantle. Alexander watched the exchange with an expression Emily couldn't decipher entirely, though she saw something warm flicker behind his composed facade, admiration mixed with gratitude and an unmistakable recognition of courage. His mother's soft smile seemed to embolden him, and he stepped forward to stand beside Emily, creating a united front that immediately altered the balance of the confrontation. The manager attempted one final push, raising his voice slightly as he warned Emily that insubordination could jeopardize her job, especially on a day when the restaurant's reputation was already at risk due to her actions. Yet the threat rang hollow in the air, weakened by the presence of a billionaire who had already witnessed the truth and had no intention of allowing intimidation to override integrity. Emily held her ground, stating that she would rather face disciplinary action than live with the knowledge that she had walked away from someone who needed her in a moment of vulnerability. Several diners glanced at one another with expressions of discomfort, perhaps realizing that they themselves had failed to uphold even a fraction of the courage displayed by the young waitress standing resolutely beside an injured stranger. The manager's jaw clenched tightly as he prepared to argue further, but before he could speak, Alexander intervened with a tone so calm and precise that it sliced cleanly through the growing tension. He stated that Emily had acted with compassion, professionalism, and courage, three qualities that any respectable establishment should value above blind obedience or superficial appearances. Alexander continued by adding that if the restaurant wished to maintain its prestigious reputation, it should start by supporting employees who upheld its values instead of punishing them for doing the right thing. The manager's face drained of color at the implication, and he stumbled through a stuttered response about miscommunication and exaggerated reactions, though the excuses crumbled under the weight of the truth visible to everyone present. Emily sensed that the room itself seemed to lean forward, awaiting the next shift in momentum, as if the outcome of this confrontation carried stakes far greater than they had initially understood. Mrs. Ward looked up at her son with quiet pride, and then turned to Emily with a sincerity that tightened the young woman's throat, telling her that true integrity could never be punished, only tested. The warmth of the elderly woman's words contrasted sharply with the cold tremor in the manager's composure, revealing a divide between those motivated by kindness and those ruled by fear. Emily once again felt the familiar tremble in her hands, though this time it wasn't from anxiety, but from the profound realization that she had chosen the right path despite the risks. As Alexander offered his mother a reassuring smile, he shifted his gaze back to Emily and asked whether she was all right, his tone carrying a depth that suggested he understood the emotional toll of standing alone in a room full of critics. Emily nodded quietly, though her heart hammered heavily in her chest, aware that the moment had thrust her into a spotlight she had never asked for, and yet somehow felt prepared to face. The subtle tremor in her voice steadied as she thanked him for his support, choosing her words carefully because she didn't want her gratitude to overshadow her own agency in the situation. The manager, fully aware that he had lost the confrontation, retreated slightly with the pretense of checking on other staff members, though his rigid posture betrayed his lingering resentment. Emily realized she had crossed an invisible line, not one of insubordination, but of self-worth, and the experience left her standing taller than before. As she remained beside Mrs. Ward with renewed calm, the restaurant seemed to breathe again, though the air still shimmered with unspoken tension as the true consequences of her moral stand continued to unfold, quietly steering all their lives toward an inevitable reckoning. A thick, brittle quiet settled over the restaurant as Emily stood beside Mrs. Ward, feeling the last echoes of her own defiant words fade into the charged stillness that had overtaken every table, every whispered conversation, and every distracted glance across the marble floors. It was the kind of silence that didn't merely fall but pressed, as if the entire room sensed that something irreversible had just occurred, and that the ground beneath them had subtly shifted in a direction no one could quite articulate. Even the clinking silverware and muted murmurs typical of a busy lunch service had dissolved, replaced by an uneasy awareness that the events unfolding before them were no longer a mere inconvenience, but the prelude to a larger storm. Emily tried to steady her breathing as she adjusted the blanket across Mrs. Ward's lap, though her hands shook slightly from the heavy mix of adrenaline and fear still lingering in her limbs. She could feel the eyes of dozens of diners on her, some curious, some ashamed, and some plainly unsettled by the realization that their indifference had been exposed in the harshest possible light. The businessmen who had mocked her earlier sat frozen with stiff smiles, their bravado evaporating so completely that they now resembled men awaiting a verdict, rather than individuals enjoying a luxury meal. Alexander remained close, his presence an anchor in the swirling uncertainty, and though he said little, the calm authority radiating from him felt like a quiet shield that kept the worst of the room's tension from reaching her. Yet, Emily sensed that something deeper was shifting inside him as well, a subtle transformation in the way he watched her no longer, with curiosity alone, but with a growing recognition of the strength she had revealed. His mother observed the unspoken connection with a gentle, knowing smile, her eyes filled with warmth rather than worry, as though she trusted the unfolding moment more than anyone else in the room. Before Emily could fully regain her composure, the sharp click of hurried footsteps echoed from the front entrance, carrying a note of urgency that sliced through the hushed atmosphere and drew every gaze toward the doorway. A young hostess rushed toward the alcove, her face flushed and her hands clasped tightly around a small tablet used to manage reservations, signaling that she carried news too important to ignore. She leaned in close to the manager and whispered something that caused his face to drain of color instantly, leaving him standing rigidly as if rooted to the ground by pure fear. Without waiting for permission, the hostess stepped forward and addressed Alexander directly, informing him in a trembling voice that the restaurant's owner had arrived unexpectedly and was on his way to the dining area. She added, with clear anxiety, that the owner had reviewed security footage sent by a concerned employee and was demanding to know why an elderly woman had been left unattended on the floor for several minutes while staff and guests looked on. The words reverberated through the restaurant like a sudden gust of cold air, casting a shadow across the faces of those who had allowed the incident to unfold unchecked. Emily felt her stomach twist at the realization that the owner's arrival would escalate the situation far beyond anything she had imagined, bringing consequences that could easily sweep her into their path whether she desired attention or not. She glanced toward Alexander, searching for reassurance, and found him watching her with a steady gaze that conveyed both sympathy and a strange sense of inevitability, as though he had known from the moment he entered the restaurant that events would eventually reach this boiling point. His mother, sensing the shift, patted Emily's hand softly and whispered that she should not fear the truth, because truth had a way of revealing character more clearly than any apology or excuse. Moments later, a distinguished man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit strode into the dining room with purposeful strides, his expression carved into a stern mask that signaled he already knew precisely where to direct his attention. The staff scrambled to follow his movements, though the authority that radiated from him created an invisible barrier that prevented anyone from approaching too closely. He headed straight for the alcove where Emily stood beside Mrs. Ward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scene, the wheelchair, the daughterly concern in Emily's posture, and the quiet fury simmering beneath Alexander's otherwise composed exterior. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an authoritative weight that commanded immediate silence as he asked who had assisted the injured guest and why she had been left vulnerable for so long. The manager attempted to step forward with a rehearsed explanation, but his words dissolved under the intensity of the owner's scrutiny, leaving him fumbling helplessly as he struggled to piece together a narrative that might salvage his career. Emily watched with growing unease, realizing that the owner's gaze was shifting toward her, not with accusation, but with a solemn expectation that she would either confirm or unravel the story being fed to him. Before she could respond, Alexander stepped forward, positioning himself protectively between Emily and the owner, as he stated with unwavering clarity that Emily alone had acted while others failed, and that any attempt to distort the truth would be met with immediate challenge. His voice, calm yet edged with restrained anger, left no room for misinterpretation, and the owner's expression softened just enough to show that he recognized the weight of the Ward family's influence. The manager paled even further, visibly sinking into the realization that he had been hoping to rewrite a story that was already etched into the restaurant's security logs and the memories of every diner present. The owner nodded at Alexander's statement before turning his attention back to Emily, studying her with a mixture of respect and concern that sent a rush of unwanted heat to her cheeks. He asked whether she was all right, whether she needed a break, and whether she had been threatened or silenced by anyone in authority, a series of questions that revealed a deeper understanding of service industry dynamics than she had expected from someone in his position. Emily answered carefully, maintaining honesty without embellishment, but she noticed that her voice carried more confidence than she felt, strengthened by the silent support of the Ward family standing beside her. As she finished speaking, the owner exhaled slowly, as though he had pieced together the full picture, and Emily felt the energy in the room shift again, signaling the quiet but undeniable turning point that would transform every moment that followed. The balance of power had fully, irrevocably changed, no longer resting in the hands of those who mocked or ignored, but firmly aligned with truth, integrity, and the young woman who had refused to walk away when compassion mattered most. The restaurant's atmosphere tightened once more as the owner finished listening to Emily's quiet explanation, though before he could address the remaining tension, an unmistakable shift rippled through the dining room, as a second wave of authority entered the space like a silent but undeniable tide. Several heads turned instinctively toward the entrance, where two sharply dressed security personnel stepped inside with brisk, purposeful strides, surveying the room with disciplined precision, as though they were accustomed to safeguarding individuals whose presence carried far more weight than the average diner. Their discreet earpieces and measured movements signaled that someone important had arrived, someone whose identity needed no introduction once he finally crossed the threshold. A few seconds later, a tall man with silvering hair and a commanding presence approached the dining area, his stride steady and confident despite the sudden hush that swept across the tables like wind folding through quiet grass. He exuded a level of influence that required no announcement, the kind of controlled power that made people straighten automatically, even before recognizing who he was. Emily felt her pulse quicken as she sensed that this new arrival had come not to observe but to intervene, and that whatever happened next would push the afternoon toward a decisive, irreversible direction. The moment he laid eyes on Mrs. Ward, his composure broke with startling tenderness as he hurried toward the alcove, his expression shifting from firm resolve to raw concern faster than anyone in the room could fully process. Emily stepped aside instinctively as the man reached the wheelchair and dropped to one knee without hesitation, his hands trembling slightly as he cupped Mrs. Ward's face like someone who had feared losing her long before he learned of her fall. The elderly woman smiled with a mixture of relief and affection, whispering his name gently as though soothing a frightened child hidden beneath a hardened exterior. Emily glanced at Alexander and saw the faintest flicker of recognition pass between him and the newcomer, revealing a familial bond before a single word could confirm it. The older man, clearly another Ward, then turned toward Emily with a sincere gratitude that carried the weight of someone used to guarding his emotions carefully, yet thankful enough to let vulnerability slip through. His voice, when he finally spoke, trembled with both appreciation and restrained fury, asking whether she had been the one who stayed with his wife when the rest of the restaurant failed to react. Emily answered quietly that she had only done what anyone should have done, though the older man shook his head in firm disagreement as he declared that kindness had become far rarer than she believed, and that her actions spoke far louder than she realized. The room seemed to hold its breath as his words spread through the dining area, pressing guilt deeper into the faces of those who had pretended not to see an elderly woman collapse less than an hour earlier. Even the owner stood straighter, sensing immediately that this was not merely a family matter but a moment that would reflect directly upon the reputation of his establishment. Before the tension could settle, the newly arrived ward straightened slowly, his eyes blazing with a cold, measured anger that made several diners avert their gaze as though they feared being implicated further by association. He asked the owner, without raising his voice, how long his wife had lain on the floor before receiving assistance, and whether the staff had followed proper protocol designed to protect vulnerable guests. His questions landed with the precision of arrows hitting a target, leaving the owner scrambling for answers that might soften the damage, while knowing full well that every second of hesitation worsened the impression he made. Alexander stepped closer to his father, offering a concise summary of the events he had witnessed after entering the restaurant, emphasizing Emily's swift response and contrasting it sharply against the indifference displayed by staff and diners. Though his tone remained calm, the undercurrent of protectiveness in his voice was unmistakable, revealing that the entire ordeal had pierced through layers of composure he usually maintained with iron control. Emily felt her breath catch as she realized that Alexander wasn't simply defending her, he was aligning himself with her, validating her actions publicly in a way that subtly shifted the power dynamic even further in her favor. The father listened intently, his jaw tightening with each detail, until the manager attempted once more to interject with excuses about miscommunication and momentary confusion. But the older ward silenced him with a raised hand, his expression firm and unyielding as he stated that confusion should never outweigh compassion, and that any establishment claiming excellence should prioritize humanity above aesthetics or efficiency. His voice carried a force that echoed through the restaurant, leaving no doubt that consequences would follow and that this incident had already transcended the boundaries of a simple accident. Mrs. Ward, observing the growing storm around her, lifted her hand to gently touch her husband's wrist, reminding him with a soft smile that anger was unnecessary because she was safe and because someone kind had cared for her when it mattered most. Her reassurance tempered his fury, though it did nothing to diminish the seriousness of the moment, and his next words came slower, more deliberate, as he turned toward Emily and thanked her again with a sincerity that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. He added that very few people in the world acted from instinctive compassion, and even fewer did so when surrounded by those who mocked or ignored, making her courage something both rare and remarkable. The patrons who had laughed earlier sank deeper into their seats, and the owner swallowed hard as he realized the gravity of the situation now extended beyond corporate liability or public relations. Something in the air had shifted entirely, no longer defined by tension alone, but by a dawning awareness that the Ward family commanded a level of influence capable of reshaping reputations, careers, and alliances with a single decisive sentence. Emily felt that shift too, though it pressed against her differently, not as fear, but as an overwhelming realization that her quiet act of kindness had thrust her into a spotlight she never expected. Alexander stepped closer to her, his voice low yet steady, as he asked whether she felt overwhelmed and whether she needed a moment to breathe away from the crowd's watchful eyes. Emily shook her head gently, though her heart pounded fiercely, because walking away now felt like stepping out of a story she hadn't finished living yet. The father and son exchanged a glance that carried more meaning than words, then both turned toward Emily with an unspoken agreement forming between them, one that suggested her presence was no longer incidental but central to everything unraveling before them. And in that charged moment, as authority, responsibility, and gratitude converged around her, Emily realized that power had truly arrived, not in the form of vengeance or dominance, but as a force that illuminated truth, restored dignity, and protected those who chose compassion, even when it came at a cost. A heavy stillness settled across the restaurant as the Ward family remained gathered around Emily, and in that charged pause the hierarchy of the entire room seemed to flip itself inside out, revealing truths that had been hiding beneath polished surfaces and forced smiles since the moment the elderly woman had fallen. The diners who once lounged comfortably behind the safety of their wealth now sat rigid, their shoulders stiff with anxiety as they realized that the careless laughter they had offered so freely moments earlier had suddenly become a liability rather than a shield. Even the steady hum of background conversation collapsed entirely, leaving behind a silence so complete that the sound of a chair leg scraping faintly against the marble felt like a shattering crack in fragile glass. The owner, whose confident posture had already begun to buckle under the weight of the unfolding situation, cleared his throat and attempted to position himself closer to the Ward family, likely trying to appear attentive and responsible before anyone else could expose his shortcomings. Yet his efforts only emphasized the widening gap between authority rooted in genuine empathy and authority clinging to superficial control, a contrast that every pair of watching eyes registered with silent judgment. Emily felt the shift acutely, sensing that she had unintentionally stepped into the center of a moral reckoning that no management script or polished apology could soften. Alexander's father straightened, letting his gaze sweep across the room with a calm severity that carried the unmistakable force of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his voice. He addressed the patrons collectively, thanking those who had shown concern but emphasizing with quiet precision that his wife had lain on the floor for far longer than acceptable while too many watched without lifting a hand. His words landed with unrelenting clarity, cutting through the air like a steady blade that exposed every silent bystander, every disinterested glance, and every cowardly smirk disguised as indifference. Several diners shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, while others attempted to disguise their guilt behind apologetic nods, though none dared to speak first for fear of drawing attention to their earlier negligence. The businessmen who had mocked Emily the loudest looked particularly shaken, their faces drained of confidence as they sat trapped in seats that now felt more like judgment benches than dining chairs. One of them attempted to smile weakly, as though hoping a pleasant expression might erase the memory of his cruelty. But the attempt collapsed instantly when he realized no one was willing to validate his performance. Alexander, standing slightly behind his father, studied the room with a colder gaze than Emily had ever seen from him, and she felt a tremor run through her chest when she realized that his silence wasn't anger, it was calculation. He remembered faces, tones, gestures. He remembered who laughed, who turned away, who muttered complaints about inconvenience, while his mother lay helpless on the ground. And though he didn't voice it aloud, Emily sensed that none of those individuals would be forgotten, because people like Alexander recognized moral failures as clearly as they recognized business ones. The owner finally stepped forward, trying to redirect the attention toward himself by offering a sweeping apology on behalf of the restaurant, promising a full internal review to ensure incidents like this would never repeat. His words were well polished and carefully selected, but the strained edge beneath them revealed a man more concerned with salvaging reputation than responding to the human reality unfolding in front of him. Emily felt slightly dizzy as she observed the unfolding scene, realizing that she was witnessing the unraveling of power structures she had lived under for years, structures built on fear, submission, and silent acceptance. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Ward lifted her hand gently, signaling that she wished to speak despite the tension pressing around her like a tightening net. Her voice, though softened by age and pain, carried a clarity that silenced every movement in the room as she expressed her disappointment, not in the fall itself, but in the fact that her suffering had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a call to action. She looked around the restaurant slowly, her gaze lingering on the businessmen who had mocked Emily, and told them kindly but firmly that wealth never protected anyone from vulnerability and that no one's dignity should depend on social status. Her words landed with a quiet force that pierced deeper than any harsh reprimand could, and Emily watched in awe as even the proudest faces softened slightly under the weight of her sincerity. There was no anger in her tone, only truth layered gently with empathy, and that gentleness made the shame it evoked feel sharper than any shouted accusation. Several diners bowed their heads respectfully, and Emily felt her heart clench as she realized that Mrs. Ward's humility carried more power than the combined authority of the entire establishment. Alexander stepped closer to his mother, resting a steady hand on the back of her wheelchair, and then he turned deliberately toward the table of businessmen whose laughter had sparked the humiliation Emily had endured. His expression tightened as he told them calmly that he had recognized every word they had spoken, and that their behavior reflected a lack of basic decency he would not forget. The men stiffened visibly, each trying to mask their panic beneath thin smiles, but their eyes betrayed them, revealing the raw fear that came when privilege collided with unfiltered accountability. Emily felt a strange mixture of vindication and discomfort washing through her, because this moment of public reversal wasn't something she had sought or even imagined, yet she couldn't deny the sense of justice slowly weaving itself across the tense room. She took a cautious breath, aware that her presence at the center of all this attention felt overwhelming, yet also aware that retreating now would undermine the integrity she had upheld when she refused to abandon Mrs. Ward earlier. So she remained where she stood, close enough to offer comfort, yet grounded enough to face the shifting tide of power without shrinking away. The owner attempted once more to guide the narrative toward reconciliation by offering complimentary meals, future reservations, and vague promises of retraining, but his words dissolved into the air like static noise because nobody was interested in hospitality perks when morality itself had just been assessed before their eyes. The diners were no longer here for cuisine or ambiance. They were witnesses to a reckoning, and their silence reflected the uncomfortable awakening that no amount of luxury could shield them from the consequences of their inaction. Alexander's father finally turned back to Emily and thanked her again, this time loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, telling her that her instinctive kindness had restored his faith in the values too many claimed, yet too few demonstrated. The sincerity of his words wrapped around her like warm sunlight after a storm, grounding her in a moment that felt unreal, powerful, and deeply human all at once. And as every eye in the room shifted toward her, not with mockery but with respect, Emily realized that the roles had fully reversed, not through vengeance, but through truth stepping boldly into the light and illuminating everything that had remained hidden in the shadows. The air inside the restaurant thickened as the weight of Alexander's father's words settled over the crowd, creating an atmosphere so taut that even the clinking of a distant glass caused several diners to flinch with anxious awareness. Emily could feel that the moment for polite silence had passed, replaced by a reckoning none of the onlookers could sidestep, because the truth now hung in the open like a bright, unwavering light that revealed every fault line running through the room. Although she stood quietly beside Mrs. Ward, she sensed that her presence had become the fulcrum upon which the entire confrontation balanced, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality of their own choices. The owner shifted nervously, his polished facade cracking with each passing second as he realized that the Ward family expected accountability, not excuses, and that the restaurant's future reputation hinged entirely on how he handled this situation. He attempted to address the room again, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his panic as he explained that the establishment prided itself on excellence and professionalism, values he claimed were misrepresented by the actions of isolated individuals rather than the entire staff. Yet his explanation faltered almost immediately, because no one believed negligence could be reduced to a single employee's error when the entire dining room had witnessed a collective failure of humanity. Alexander stepped forward, cutting through the owner's speech with a calm precision that carried far more authority than raised voices ever could, stating that professionalism meant nothing if workers were punished for choosing compassion over image. He reminded the room that the only person who had acted swiftly was a young waitress whose income depended on obeying orders, yet whose conscience had guided her more effectively than any corporate policy. His tone remained steady, but his words struck like a slow, deliberate hammer, dismantling the excuses being offered and exposing the truth without embellishment or rage. The businessmen who had mocked Emily earlier sat frozen in their seats, their expressions twisted with the quiet dread of men who realized too late that they had been recorded and judged by more than just the Ward family. One of them attempted to rise, presumably to apologize, but his voice cracked halfway through a sentence, leaving him standing awkwardly before sinking back into his chair under the weight of his own shame. The attempt at redemption fell flat, not because remorse was unwelcome, but because the timing made it painfully obvious that his motives stemmed from fear rather than from any sincere acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Emily watched the exchange with a conflicted heart, feeling simultaneously vindicated and overwhelmed, because she had never wanted to humiliate anyone. She had only wanted to help a woman who had fallen. Yet, she couldn't deny that seeing arrogance stripped away so completely stirred something deep within her. A quiet affirmation that doing the right thing mattered, even when the world dismissed kindness as weakness. Mrs. Ward reached for her hand gently, offering a reassuring squeeze that reminded her she was not alone in the storm swirling around them. The owner turned toward the manager next, his expression darkening into something far more resolute as he asked for a full account of how the situation had been handled from the moment Mrs. Ward fell. The manager stuttered through his explanation, attempting to emphasize that Emily had acted out of turn and that he had been preparing to help but was interrupted. His excuses, however, carried the hollow ring of someone constructing a narrative on trembling stilts, and the older Ward's tightening jaw suggested he found the performance both insulting and transparent. Alexander raised a hand to stop the manager mid-sentence, stating calmly that he had watched the security footage sent to him and seen exactly how long Mrs. Ward had remained on the floor before anyone responded. The entire room inhaled sharply as the truth crystallized in that single sentence, because his tone revealed that he was not speaking hypothetically or relying on Emily's retelling he had witnessed every moment with his own eyes. The businessmen paled even further, while the manager's throat worked in a silent plea that dissolved into the stale air between them. The owner's face tightened as he processed the revelation, and his voice carried a stern gravity when he announced that the restaurant would conduct an immediate internal review and that employees responsible for negligence would face disciplinary action. His declaration sent a ripple of shock across the staff members, some of whom wore expressions of fear, while others showed quiet relief, perhaps grateful that their unspoken discomfort with previous management would finally be addressed. Emily felt her stomach twist, both anxious and hopeful, sensing that change was approaching, though she wasn't sure whether it would amplify or erase her place within this world. But the older Ward wasn't finished. He turned toward the businessmen with a chillingly composed expression, informing them that while he believed in grace, he also believed in accountability, and that mockery of the vulnerable had no place in any establishment he chose to frequent. His words were crisp and measured, yet the message landed with devastating clarity. Their behavior had been seen, judged, and remembered by people whose influence extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. One of the men opened his mouth to speak, but when Mrs. Ward lifted her hand gently to silence him, his protest died instantly, replaced by a haunted look that spoke of consequences already forming. Emily felt a knot tighten in her throat as she realized just how deeply her small act of compassion had pierced a world she had never belonged to, revealing fractures that power alone could not mend. She sensed the burden of attention pressing against her, not as praise but as responsibility, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth that her choices had initiated a ripple that now touched careers, reputations, and fragile egos. Yet when she glanced toward Alexander, she found his gaze steady and warm, grounding her with a subtle nod that promised she had nothing to regret. The owner, acknowledging the gravity of the moment, asked Mrs. Ward whether she wished to move to a quieter space, but she shook her head gently and stated that she preferred to remain where Emily was. Her simple sentence struck the room with more impact than any reprimand, drawing several gasps from onlookers who understood immediately that this young waitress had earned a place at the center of the Ward family's trust. Emily felt her heart clench as she knelt beside the older woman once more, adjusting the blanket across her knees with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the towering tension still pulsing through the restaurant. In that suspended moment, as the Ward family stood united in truth and the diners bowed under the weight of their own reflection, Emily realized that public reckoning was never about fear or punishment. It was about seeing clearly, seeing who stood up, who stepped back, who chose silence, and who chose kindness when no one was watching. And for the first time since the ordeal began, she understood that she had not simply witnessed justice unfold, she had become part of the force that called it forward. The air inside the restaurant trembled with unspoken anticipation as the final echoes of the public reckoning faded, leaving behind a charged stillness that felt heavier than any sound that could have filled the room. Emily stood quietly beside Mrs. Ward, her senses sharpened by the gravity of what had just occurred, aware that the next words spoken would determine whether the afternoon spiraled into punishment or transformed into something unexpectedly redemptive. Every face in the restaurant, from the anxious waitstaff to the humbled diners, reflected a raw vulnerability that had been absent earlier, as though the confrontation had stripped away layers of pretense and forced everyone to confront a truth they long avoided. The owner took a small step forward, his expression carrying a mixture of dread and determination as he prepared to face the consequences that had grown too large to contain. His voice trembled slightly as he apologized once more on behalf of the establishment, more human beneath. He asked once more if Emily wished to accompany them to the car, not out of obligation but because her presence had become a source of calm for his mother, who clung gently to Emily's hand with a familiarity that felt surprisingly natural. Emily hesitated for a heartbeat, unsure whether she should intrude further into a family's private world, yet the warmth in Mrs. Ward's expression erased her doubt almost instantly. Outside, the cool air carried the fading scent of the morning rain, and the gentle breeze brushed against Emily's face as she helped position the wheelchair near the waiting vehicle. Alexander assisted his mother carefully, his movements filled with a protective devotion that made Emily's chest tighten with an inexplicable mixture of admiration and tenderness. When he finally turned toward her, his expression softened entirely, revealing gratitude that reached far beyond the polite thanks offered inside the restaurant. He told her that he would like to help in any way he could, whether with her education, her work, or anything she needed, not as repayment but as recognition of the compassion she had shown, without expecting anything in return. Emily felt her cheeks warm at the sincerity of his offer, though she shook her head gently, explaining that she hadn't acted to gain anything, she had simply done what she hoped someone would have done for her own family. Alexander's smile deepened, carrying a quiet respect that suggested her humility only strengthened his resolve to support her. Mrs. Ward reached from the car and placed her hand over Emily's, thanking her once more with a trembling voice that made the younger woman swallow hard to keep her emotions in check. She said that Emily had reminded her there were still people in the world who valued kindness above convenience, and that such hearts were rare enough to be treasured. Emily blinked back unexpected tears, touched by the older woman's gentle wisdom, and felt something inside her shift, an understanding that this moment would linger within her far longer than the fear or humiliation ever had. As the car door closed softly, Emily stepped back onto the sidewalk, watching the vehicle pull away with a mix of relief and bittersweet longing for a day that had changed her life in ways she had not yet fully grasped. She walked slowly back toward the restaurant entrance, feeling the sun warm her face as a sense of quiet strength blossomed within her, replacing the self-doubt that had once shadowed every shift she worked. The glass doors reflected her image faintly, and for the first time she saw not a timid waitress struggling to endure long hours, but a young woman who had stood her ground when kindness demanded courage. Inside, the staff parted respectfully as she returned, offering grateful smiles rather than the dismissive glances she had grown accustomed to, and several guests nodded softly as though acknowledging her with newfound understanding. The atmosphere felt transformed, infused with a gentle humility that had not existed before, as if everyone had absorbed a lesson that would linger long after the tables were cleared and the lights dimmed. Emily exhaled deeply, her heart calm for the first time since the chaos began, knowing she had done something that mattered, even if only for one fragile moment, and a truth she would never forget. In a room full of wealth, The most valuable act had come from someone who owned nothing but her willingness to care.